Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about my top 10 non-sci-fi fantasy books of 2021. So as I mentioned in my sci-fi fantasy video previously, which I will link down below if you haven't seen that yet, I went over my top 10 favorite science fiction and fantasy books from last year. I did do a mid-year video that was talking about my favorite books of the year so far, and a lot of these that I'm going to feature in this video were already talked about in that one. So how I'm going to do this video is I'm still going to mention the ones I had mentioned before, but I'm not going to go as into detail on my thoughts and on why I loved them. I'll still of course mention, the top points on why I loved them, but I'm not going to go into as much detail. So if you want to see more detailed thoughts on those ones, I'll link that video down below. I do have a couple of new ones to mention here, but I did not read a whole lot more of favorites since that video, so I don't have as many to mention as I did in my sci-fi fantasy video, unfortunately. So the ones that I do have though, let's talk about those because they're amazing. They're definitely all-time favorites. So let's just get right into it. The first one I want to mention is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. This is my first time reading a Cormac McCarthy book, and oh my god, this was so emotional. So good. It was a very short story in this post-apocalyptic world where we follow a man and his son as they journey through this world and try to survive it. And that's it. And it's a very simple story, but at the heart of it is about love between a father and son and the lengths you'll go for your child. And it is just beautiful. I cried. It was amazing. The writing style is really unique where we don't use a lot of punctuation. So it's a little jarring at first to get used to. And the dialogue, the way it's written, it doesn't have a lot of dialogue tags. So it's really unique in the way it's written, but I really liked it because it really made you focus solely on the story that was being told. And it was very to the point, and it was just short, but so impactful. It really packed an emotional punch, and I loved it. I loved just the journey, and it was heartbreaking but beautiful. And I know a lot of you have recommended the movie to me, and I'm too afraid to watch the movie because this was so sad that I don't know that I want to cry at a movie for like the whole 2 hours or whatever, however long the movie is. I don't know that I want to do that, so I might pass on the movie, but I love the book. The next one is one that I read at the very beginning of the year, but I just hadn't mentioned in that mid-year video, but it's still amazing. It's The Dream Daughter by Diane Chamberlain, and I read this at a time where I was pregnant with a baby girl. I've had that baby girl. It was a wonderful year. But this story follows a pregnant woman who discovers that she's having a daughter, and that daughter is going to have a defect that is deadly to that child. So there is not a very high survival rate for this defect, and she's living in, I think, the 70s. And it's a time where medicine isn't advanced enough to cure her child, to make sure that her child can survive. So she finds out that someone close to her is actually a time traveler, which is, whoa, who could see that one coming? And she is able to travel forward in time to a time where medicine has advanced enough to save her daughter. And she does it. And it is, this one, I mean, talk about emotional. This one, I think, again, I read it at a time in my life where I related very much to the main character. It was very, very emotional. It took turns that I wasn't expecting, and it hurt, like a lot. It hurt. It was tough to read for sure, but it was so beautiful. Again, it's those themes of motherhood and the lengths a mother will go for their child, and it's an amazing story. So I bawled like a baby while I was reading this. And I don't typically love time travel in my books. Like, I love the idea of time travel, but I've yet to find stories where I really love the time travel aspect. And this one was really well done, where it didn't take over the story. It just kind of helped the emotional impact of the story. Like, it wasn't, I would not call this a time travel book. This is very much a contemporary with time travel as a part of it, if that makes sense. Like, it's not sci-fi or anything like that. But I loved it. I loved it. Another one, and it was my last read of 2021, and I'm so glad that I ended on such a high for the year, and it was The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby DeRay. This one was incredible. It was so good. It follows a young girl named Adani who grows up in this Nigerian village, and something happens where she has to flee that village, and her goal in life is to get an education. That's all she wants. And she overcomes so much on her journey to getting that education. And it is just the most beautifully told story of the strength of Adani as a main character, and the things she has to go through is just heart-wrenching, but it's so impactful. Like, this reminded me why I love reading so much, because I love the ability to get a peek into someone's life where you would never get that opportunity to do so otherwise, unless it was through a book like this. And it made you so grateful. It made me so grateful for all the things that I have in life that you take for granted. Like, the smallest things that you take for granted, this book makes you so thankful for them. Like an education, that's something I completely take for granted. The main character of Adani, it's like so inspiring. Like, I wish I could be as strong as Adani. Like, her strength is something that inspires me. So I love this story for what it reminded me of and for what it made me aware of, and I highly recommend it. It's just stunning. And then the last of the ones that I haven't mentioned previously is actually a nonfiction, and it is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, who is a lawyer who focuses specifically on death row cases where his clients have been wrongfully convicted of crimes that have put them on death row, and he is working to get them free. And it's a beautifully written book where the author focuses kind of his entire narrative. The whole book focuses on one particular story of a man named Walter McMillan who was wrongfully convicted of a crime that he absolutely did not commit. And he gets found guilty of it, is put on death row, and Bryan Stevenson, as his lawyer, is telling Walter's story. And that story in itself is unbelievable. It just is so eye-opening and so powerful. But what I love even more so about this book is you have that story, that even if it was just that story, it would be an amazing book. But not only do you have that, you also have all of these other stories that Stevenson weaves into that overarching story and narrative, and it just shows you how often our justice system is unjust. And it's just very eye-opening. I think that this should be required reading. Please, if you have not read this book, please read this book. I said before in the wrap-up that I featured this in. If there's one book from my channel that you take away and you read because of my channel, I want it to be Just Mercy. That's the one. Like, of all of them that I recommend, I want this one to be the one that people pick up the most. Unbelievably important that more people are aware of what is happening. It's still to this day. So please pick up Just Mercy. It's gorgeously told and very, very powerful. Right, and all the other books that I'm going to talk about I have already mentioned before, so I'm not going to go into as much detail, but let's chat about them anyway. The first one is Anxious People by Fredrick Backman, which is my 4th or 5th Fredrick Backman. I've read a lot of his books, and while Beartown I think is still my absolute favorite, I think this one takes 2nd place, which is still incredible because Beartown is like one of my all-time favorites. This one is like right there. It was so good. It was just so fun. Like, it was very lighthearted in tone compared to Beartown, which was very heavy with its themes and with its tone. This one was a lot more lighthearted. It follows a bank robber who, something goes wrong, and they take this apartment tour hostage. All these people who are touring this apartment next door to this bank are taken hostage by the bank robber. And it's just kind of the story of them all getting to know each other and interacting, and the characters that you're introduced to, while none of them are like the most lovable human beings, I think that they're all just so quirky and fun, and I loved them. Like, I loved the dynamics between all these characters. I loved the kind of like the ending and how it all tied everything together, and just, it was just fun. And it kept this lighthearted tone throughout, but it also talked about some more serious themes as well. So I highly recommend this one, especially if you are a character-driven reader. There's not a whole lot of plot in this one. It's very character-driven. And especially if you're a character-driven reader who just loves flawed characters, but just fascinating, really well-written characters. Like, I think that Fredrick Backman writes characters that feel so real, and I love his stories for that. Oh, highly recommend it. Next one I have is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix, which is my second book by this author, and I prefer this one over Southern Book Club. I always mess up that title. Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I like this one more. This one is definitely 5 stars. I think what I love so much about this one, I mean, the title kind of gives away what it's about, right? It's about this high schooler whose best friend, she thinks, becomes possessed by a demon, and it's horror, but it's almost like this comedic horror where it doesn't take itself very seriously. And what I love about Grady Hendrix that I've noticed from now reading 2 of his books is his character work really works for me. Like, these characters in this book, the 2 main high school friends, it felt like I was reading about a friendship with my own friends from like elementary school through high school. Like, he writes, I don't know how he does it. I don't know how he writes such realistic teenage girls. I mean, I felt like we spend like the first part of this book with these 2 main characters like kind of having this blossoming friendship while they're really young. I think they're like elementary school age. And I was like, this feels like me, like my childhood. Like, I don't know how he so perfectly captured what that type of friendship could look like. Because I was so invested in the friendship from the very start, I was so enthralled with the story throughout. And, I think it's fun when it gets to the part where the title kind of gives away, but I just loved it. I loved the character work in this one, and it's set in the 80s, so it's very nostalgic for the 80s. If you love the 80s in that time period, this may also appeal to you. I'm not like obsessed with the 80s, but I appreciated like the nostalgia factor in this, and how Grady Hendrix kind of threw in some of those nostalgia moments. So it was so much fun. I just had such a blast with this book. The next one is one from my dear friend Joshana. She just loves this book so much, and I had to pick it up off of her recommendation, and I'm so glad I did because I loved it. City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. This one is another character-driven novel that is set in the 1930s, 1940s, and it is following Vivian, who is like teenage girl, 19-year-old, I think she's 19, 19, who moves to New York City and wants to start this new life for herself, and she gets involved in kind of the show business a little bit, like in the behind the scenes of the show business and theater and stuff like that. And what's so cool about this novel is the way it's told. You have an older Vivian who I think is in her like 60s or 70s. She is telling her story about her younger self to someone else. And so what I loved about this book a lot, besides like the writing style was amazing, I loved the extra commentary we were able to get from like an older Vivian looking back at her younger self. You felt so much closer to Vivian, the way it was told. I loved that. And the writing style, I swear, Elizabeth Gilbert is amazing with the writing. Like, there were some moments where I was laughing harder than I've ever laughed at any book. There is one chapter in particular where I laughed harder than I've ever laughed at any other book. But then, so she can make you laugh, but then she can make you feel so much dread and fear. There was certain chapters where the tone would change and the characters would get into situations that were really sketchy, and like you felt like you were there with the characters. Like, she just did such a good job of like putting you right there with the characters. I loved the themes of like independence and freedom and being whoever you want to be, no matter who that is, that's okay. And like, it was just gorgeously written, gorgeously told. I loved it. So highly recommend this one. Thank you, Jashana, for the amazing recommendation. I also have Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, which I feel like I've talked about in quite a few videos already, so you've probably heard me already gush about this one. This is a multi-generational novel that follows 300 years of a family that starts in Ghana. So you start off with these two sisters who have very, very different experiences in Ghana, and they're half-sisters, and one of them starts off as a slave and is shipped to America, and the other one is married off to this wealthy white man and stays in Ghana. But you also follow their ancestors, so you are shown the impact of the choices that your ancestors made, how that affects your own life moving forward and affects your own journey. And it was just so well executed, this way that a story was told. I've never read a book like that where that was the way it was executed, and I thought it was so well done. We spent just enough time with each of the different characters that I felt really invested in their story, and I felt like I got a complete like peek into their life. Like I got enough of them to really care, and then we moved on to the next one, and every time we would move on to the next character, I'd be kind of bummed because I was like, oh man, but I loved that previous character. But then we would get introduced to a new one that you ended up loving. So she did such a good job of tracing these family roots and showing the impact of previous decisions or things that happened to their ancestors, how that impacted them. Just explored gorgeous themes, and it kind of leaves off in current day, so it just feels like you come full circle at the end, and it's so gorgeous. Like I cried. It was so beautiful. So I highly recommend this one. I'm really excited to read her other book, Transcendent Kingdom. I'm gonna read that this year, and I can't wait to explore more of this author's works because I thought that this was so gorgeously written. All right, and then we have another nonfiction, Atomic Habits by James Clear. The reason I loved this nonfiction about how to form better habits, how to break bad habits, was because of how actionable it was. It really gave you some next steps and some really easy to accomplish things that you can do in your everyday life to apply these concepts. That's what I loved about this. So this was not just kind of a theories book about habits. It really was like a guide on how to do better habits and how to break habits. Like, it really showed you the steps to do that. So I loved it for that. I've tabbed it up. I plan on revisiting this one, and I will continue to apply a lot of the things I learned from this in my own life. I loved it for that. So highly recommend this one, especially if you're newer to nonfiction books about habits. This was the first one I had read, so a lot of these concepts were new to me, and I really appreciated this book and what it showed me. And then finally, the 10th book is Carrie by Stephen King, which is now, I think, my favorite Stephen King. And I just loved the character of Carrie. I loved her. And I listened to this one on audio. The audiobook narrator is Sissy Spacek, who starred in the original Carrie adaptation. And I think that had a lot to do with my enjoyment because she did a phenomenal job as the narrator. But I thought that Carrie's not necessarily like the scariest horror book. It's not scary. I don't think it's scary, but what's scary about it is the way that humans treat other human beings. That's the horror aspect, and that's what a lot of Stephen King's books explore. They're not necessarily like the scariest until you really realize like what other human beings are doing to people. Like, how can we treat others like that? So like, that's what I loved about this book, was Carrie's struggles and examining how the scariest thing can be how you're treated by your own mother, your classmates, anything. Like the effects of bullying and the effects of a toxic home life and just what that will drive someone to do. Oh my goodness. Like, I felt so much for Carrie. Like, I felt so bad for her. So I loved Carrie. It totally worked for me. So those were my top 10 favorite non-science fiction fantasy books of 2021. Did you see any that you've read before, and what did you think of them? I would love to know. And what was your favorite non-science fiction fantasy book from last year? Definitely leave those comments down below. I would love to know. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.